Being able to shoot an original Mississippi rifle was always on my bucket list, so I was very happy when a shooter friend of mine notified me that he has one for sale. The rifle was really nice. It was the original, unmodified model 1841 rifle with the original caliber, but the bore had some rusty spots. There are not too many of these rifles out there in the original configuration, so I decided to take a risk. And I was right. What you see is the first session to 50 meters using patched 5.25 round ball and powder charge replicating the original service charge of the rifle. Well, there are some fires here. There are some shots that are in, let's say, in the size of the 10 ring at 50 meters, which is quite good, and this is our goal. And I collected some patches to determine what's the problem, why we have these flyers, and it's easily visible that I have some punctured, damaged patches. And in case of these patches, I'm pretty sure that the bullet is not hitting into the right spot. So, meaning that I will still have to work on the barrel. Let's polish it a bit more. But it's a good start because all the shots are within the size of a 9 ring, which is quite good. And some are really tight, so which means that the rifle can shoot. But we will see what it will deliver after we further clean the grooves and the lens.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is capandball here, your favorite gun channel in beautiful, bright English language, and today I'm continuing the series about the Mississippi rifle and the early interchangeable production for the US Army. Well, this is a very interesting story because the model 1841 Mississippi rifle, or Harper's Ferry rifle, that was one of the very first, it was the very first muzzle-loading arm to be manufactured entirely with interchangeable parts, and it was the second arm of the US Army that had a percussion ignition. The first one was a North Hole carbine, so it is an interesting arm. My rifle was made by Eli Whitney, that's a very important arms manufacturing company, who was a key player in introducing the new production method in the United States. There are many disinformation around this topic, and I'm pretty sure that in this chapter I'm going to clear some of them.
Eli Whitney Sr. was born in 1765 in Westboro, Massachusetts, and he was surely a creative man, inventing handy tools. He graduated from the Yale College in 1792 and established the venture with Phineas Miller and developed the machine to speed up the extraction of seeds from cotton. The machine was patented in 1794 and it proved to be an effective device. It was so effective that it was illegally copied by many makers, pushing Whitney into continuous legal fights, leaving him without a well-deserved profit.
Eli Whitney Sr. is often mentioned as the first US arms manufacturer who reached full interchangeability. Well, now today we know that this is not true. This is something that he wanted the Congress to believe to obtain as much government orders as possible. In the first chapter I was talking about the cartridges of the Mississippi rifle, so you can learn how to make authentic reproduction cartridges for your rifle from that video. The second chapter was focusing on firing the musket and firing the rifle parallel to each other to show you the differences between the rate of fire and the accuracy of the two guns. And the third chapter is focusing on the history of the development of the model 1841 rifle and also the history of the Eli Whitney Company. And by the way, I'm going to shoot the rifle, of course, because without burning black powder, it does not mean a thing. My rifle was in not good condition, so I had problems with the bore because it was quite rough. It had some rusted spots inside that had to be cleaned. I made a video about this. This video is accessible on 3 paid platforms. The first one, if you become a member of this channel, you can access it. It is available for my Patreon supporters also on our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/capandball, and this is also accessible on the History of Weapons and War platform, so whichever you choose, it's a perfect choice. Also on our Patreon page you find some extra material about the Mississippi rifle. I have an article, well, a little study uploaded about the manufacturing of the arms in the 30s and 40s, 1830s and 40s, after the introduction of the interchangeable manufacturing method. And I also have a little article about how the service regulations were written for cleaning the Mississippi rifle. They are quite interesting and they are available for supporters on Patreon. Don't forget that all the links for this content is accessible in the description of the video and also on these little cards here. So please, if you can, support us somehow, if it is comfortable for you and you can afford it. Thank you very much. But let's talk about now the adaptation of the Mississippi rifle. Well, the Ordnance Department decided in 1839 to replace all the common rifles that were still in service, which were breech-loading whole rifles or muzzle-loading flintlock rifles, to replace them with a percussion rifle. They decided to keep the original caliber of 54. Well, this is a nominal 54 because you know that it's a bit smaller, it's around 5.35, and they are firing the 5.25 round balls. And they decided to keep the European rifle bore length, which is 33 inches, and they decided to ask for a rifle that is manufactured with the new production method with interchangeable parts. And they asked the master armorer of the Harper's Ferry Arsenal, a guy named Benjamin Moore, to design this rifle.
By these times, the rifle works of Harper's Ferry Arsenal was the most advanced state-owned manufacturing location. It was developed by John Hancock Hall and was able to produce the whole breech-loading flintlock rifles with full interchangeability.
Moore is a very interesting personality. He is an extremely talented mechanic, an engineer-mind officer, and he started serving in the state-owned arsenals in 1812. He was serving in the Springfield Armory as well. But from 1830 he was serving in the Harper's Ferry Arsenal as master armorer, and he served there until 1849, so approximately for 2 decades. He was not just a firearms designer, but he was also a mechanic, an engineer, which means that he also developed the way to make these arms. But when he arrived to the Harper's Ferry Arsenal in 1830, he was anything but satisfied.
Moore told the following about the situation. There are customs and habits so interwoven with the very fibers of things as in some respects to be almost hopelessly remittless.
The government of the Harper's Ferry Arsenal was changing time by time. For a long period of time it was a civilian leadership, and after that it was a military leadership. Well, or Benjamin Moore, he was not a military officer. He was much more flexible than that. He was a professional leader, a very practical leader, and he always had efficiency in mind. Probably the Congress was not satisfied with the performance of the Harper's Ferry Arsenal because in 1854 they called for a trial to decide whether the civilian or the military leadership or superintendency is better for running the whole company. Well, in 1854, Moore was also called for the trial, and he had to witness and tell his point of view about the leadership. And he clearly said that military officers seldom have the technical knowledge to run such an important institute. And also the military command line, the military thinking, is fully against the creative and flexible thinking that is necessary for developing new methods for manufacturing. So Benjamin Moore believed in the innovative approach. He was so important for the system that after his death, his son approached the Congress and also the Ordnance Department to get some salary, to get some money after the inventions of his father as a compensation. And it tells a lot that the most important decision makers were all in favor of paying that money for his son. Moore's heritage and work were so respected by the Ordnance Department that General Talcott answered the following to the request of the son.
If your father's services beyond the line of his duty were to be paid for, and the amount adjusted upon the principles above stated, I can hardly name a sum that would be too great an allowance, or what would equal their value or the benefit derived from them by the government.
So Moor started working on the new rifle immediately, and he submitted several models. Out of these models, the Ordnance Board selected one in 1841, and that became the model 1841 Mississippi or Harper's Ferry rifle. Now, he also made 8 patent rifles and the gauges for the inspection of the rifles that were distributed to private contractors, because private contractors had to be involved in the manufacturing of these rifles, because the rifle works had to be modified in Harper's Ferry to start the manufacturing of the new common rifle that will replace all the previous common rifles. It was decided that both US armories has to tool up for the production of the new rifle, but it was Harper's Ferry who took the lead. But it was quite slow, because in Harper's Ferry the production only started in 1846, and until that time, and after that also, private contractors were involved. One of these companies was Eli Whitney's company. By that time it was already run by Blake Whitney, because Eli Whitney Sr. was dead. Also, it was John Griffiths from Cincinnati who was involved. His order was later taken over by Remington because he was not able to fulfill it. Edward K. Tryon was also involved, and also Robbins, Kendall, and Lawrence was also involved in the manufacturing of these rifles. But in 1846, the state-owned arsenals also started the production of the rifle.
The first contract was signed for 7,500 rifles at a cost of $13 per each. Between 1842 and 53, Whitney signed 2 other contracts for 20,100 rifles more.
Eli Whitney Sr. is said to be one of the very first advocates of the interchangeability in the US, and it was for a long time said to be the first real successful attempt for interchangeable manufacturing for firearms in the United States. Today we know that this is not true. This is only something that Eli Whitney Sr. wanted the Congress to believe, so he can acquire as much government order as possible.
The history of the Whitney Armoury can be divided into 3 distinctive periods. The early period, with Eli Whitney Sr.'s leadership, lasted from 1798 until his death in 1825. The second period, when the company was led by his nephews, lasted until 1842. And the last period, when Eli's son, Eli Whitney Jr. managed the company, lasted until 1888.
At the end of the 18th century, Eli Whitney Sr. was not a gunmaker. He was a member in the Miller and Whitney company, and they had an invention, a cotton gin. A cotton gin is a machine that is separating the seeds from the cotton. It is very useful, but the company was at the edge of bankruptcy. He needed anything to lift from the ground. And this was a time when the Congress decided to spend $800,000 for cannons and small arms. And this seemed like a good possibility to survive. That was a huge amount of money. So he immediately offered 10 to 15,000 of small arms produced for the government in a very, very short period of time. But by that time, he did not have anything to produce these guns. But the only thing he had were good friends from Yale. He had very good connections to politicians. He had a very good personal relationship to Jefferson Davis, for example. And this helped him to his first contract. He received the same kind of contract as the other manufacturers, but he received 2 times $5,000, so altogether $10,000 to set up the production of the muskets. So this was a lifesaver for him. This saved him from bankruptcy, and he also acquired a $134,000 government contract for muskets. According to his contract, he was to deliver 4,000 muskets until September 30, 1799, and exactly 1 year later, another 6,000 pieces. So he had 15 months to set up the production and to deliver the first batch of muskets. Now, this was a mission impossible, and he failed it. He was only able to deliver 500 muskets in 1801, and he could only fulfill the complete order in 1809. He was not the only one playing this game. There were other companies that went bankrupt because they were not able to fulfill the government orders. But Whitney had something that the others did not have. He had very good friends in the government. But in fact, he started to set up the production on the opposite sides of the Mill River in Connecticut. On the east bank, there were the forges, and on the west bank, there were the finishing, cutting, milling, and also the assembly departments. So it started to look like a real production center. And the labor was divided to be able to limit the necessary skilled workforce. By that time, there were 2 methods for dividing the labor, for the division of labor. The first method was the division of labor by the parts, which means that there is one single workman that is dedicated for making one part. So one guy is making the tumbler, one guy is making the trigger, and so on. The other method that was applied in Eli Whitney's factory is the division of labor by the type of work. So which means that there was one workman that was dedicated for filing, one for drilling, and so on. But they worked on many parts, but they always did the same kind of job, same kind of task. But let's get back now to interchangeability and to the question of the new production method. Eli Whitney Sr. stated that the most important goal of introducing the new production method is to reduce the necessity of the skilled workforce, so make human resource for the company much easier. Well, Mr. Whitney was probably not the most honest man of all, because many times he claimed that he is the sole inventor of the interchangeable production methods. Well, if you watch my video about the 1777 muskets, the French muskets, then you will know that, Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval or Honoré Blanc, they played an important part in developing this kind of method that was already used in Europe well before Eli Whitney invented it. So he was surely not the inventor of the new system, but he knew about the new system quite early, from friends like Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson knew about the French system, the French attempt for interchangeable manufacturing as early as 1785. The second source of the sparks for the new method of manufacturing arrived from Springfield. In 1799 he visited the arsenal, and during that time in the Springfield arsenal some elements of the new production method was already applied. He also tried to bribe workers from Springfield to come to his company and to make the special tooling that was necessary for making guns. And let's not forget Simon Morse, let's not forget John Hancock Hall. They were also working on the new concept of manufacturing in the first decades of the 19th century. If you want to get more information about the John H. Hall rifles, then please watch my video series about the flintlock breech loading rifle, because that's a beautiful concept. But let's get back to the first government contracts now. So the gun to copy was the 1763 French Charleville musket. Interchangeability was not a requirement. Sample guns were sent over to the private contractors and they had to copy it. There was absolutely no requirement for any kind of interchangeability. But as in 1801 clouds were gathering above his head, because he was not able to fulfill the order, he had to find something that he could grab to prove his existence in the system. So he decided to fool the Congress. He carefully selected 10 guns from his production, 10 muskets from his production. He fine-tuned them to make all the parts interchangeable. He brought all to the Congress trial. He disassembled them, mixed the parts, reassembled them, and made 10 working muskets again from interchangeable parts. But this was completely made up. And how we know he was a fake? Well, because we have a primary source, because Philos Blake, his nephew, was working at the company by that time, and he described what kind of machinery the company had in 1801 September.
Philos Blake, Whitney's 10-year-old nephew, described the factory in a letter to his sister Betsy in September of 1801 the following way. There is a drilling machine and a boring machine to bore the barrels, and a screw machine and 2 great large buildings, one other shop and stocking shop to stocking guns, a blacksmith shop and a trip hammer shop, and 500 guns done.
So what he had in that workshop is anything more than the old manufacturing method was necessary for an artisan gunsmith and not for a large-scale manufacturing center. But as Thomas Jefferson was elected as president, he was saved again. It is also claimed that the first milling machine was used in the Whitney Armoury as early as 1818, which is absolutely not true, because this story was made up in the beginning of the 20th century. And we also know that the straight cutting machine, as it was called by John Hancock Hall in the rifle works of the Harper's Ferry Arsenal, was already used in the 1820s. So probably that milling machine that is considered today the earliest milling machine, that was used by not Eli Whitney Sr, but Eli Whitney Jr in the 1830s, probably 1840s.
So Eli Whitney Sr. unfortunately was not the inventor of the milling machine, and he was not the inventor of the interchangeable manufacturing. And in fact, he never reached interchangeability among his muskets manufactured in his lifetime. But what he surely did was the establishment of a production center that later became one of the most advanced arms factories of the United States.
So after his death in 1825, his nephews took over the government of the company, Philos and Blake. And this was a time when the industrialization began in the area, and this was a time when they started to modernize the machinery of the factory. But the most important period of the company started in 1842, when Eli Whitney Jr. took over the leadership of the company. When they received the contract for the 1841 Mississippi rifles, interchangeability was a must. It was a basic requirement for the contract. So modernizing the factory was inevitable again. Eli Whitney Jr. started with finding the proper personnel for the job, so he hired the master armorer of the Springfield Arsenal, Thomas Warner, as a foreman. He was the key mastermind behind the modernization of the company. He purchased milling machines from Randall's Chicopee Falls shop and also purchased gun stock copying laths from Thomas Blanchard. They were the most advanced machinery available for gun making by that time.
Before the introduction of the copying lathe, stocks were fully made with handwork that limited production capacity, required advanced skills, and questioned interchangeability. The Blanchard lathe used a template stock to guide the milling head, so major dimensions were uniform.
He also bought a very important application, a very important help for making the Mississippi rifles, which was not existent before in the factory, a rifling machine. And we have a very good example to show that the company was really industrialized. This was the time when Samuel Colt approached Eli Whitney to manufacture 1,000 of his Walker Colts. This was the Whitneyville Walker Colt. And they did it in 6 months, which was a great achievement because before that time they never ever made any kind of pistols.
Same range, same rifle, same charge, same 50-meter distance. This is the first trial of my rifle after cleaning and lead lapping the rough parts of my bore. Let's see if my work made any difference in the accuracy.
And I'm happy, ladies and gentlemen, because the bore cleaned up very well. The original Mississippi rifle can still shoot a competition-grade group at 50 meters, which means that these 5 shots are in the size of the 10 ring, which is very, very good. That is perfect. Well, the bore is not 100% perfect condition, but who cares when it can still shoot the patch ball very accurately. I had one flyer here, but that was me. It was not the mistake of the rifle. I just felt that the butt of the rifle is not in the right position in my shoulder, and this caused this flyer here. But all the rest is good, ladies and gentlemen. I can push the bullet down with the same force. I don't have to hammer it, and after 6 or 7 shots it is still very easy to rev it down to place. I love that. Well, that was a good project.
In the 1850s, the company was very close to interchangeability, to full interchangeability. The military orders, they were fulfilled with full interchangeable arms, but all the parts that were rejected or condemned, they were used for civilian arms where let's say, the quality control was not that necessary. Eli Whitney Jr. was planning to retire in 1860, but as the Civil War broke out in 1861, he reorganized the company and started the production of the Springfield rifle muskets, the 1861 Springfield rifle muskets, and he carried on supplying the US Army with arms during the conflict. He carried on working up until 1888 when he sold the entire company, and technically this is the end of the Whitney Company. So ladies and gentlemen, this was quite an interesting story, I guess. The Whitney Company and the Mississippi Rifle story, they are all connected together, and they are all connected to the new concept of manufacturing. So next time if you hear that Eli Whitney was the inventor of the new production method, you will know that there are at least 2 Eli Whitneys, and the young one well, he was the one who was the really important in this question, because he actually reached the interchangeability, and his father, Senior, well, he was not that good in it. But anyway, it's an interesting story, and all the interesting stories are great information sources for the firearms nuts like us. So ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in. You've been watching the Capandball YouTube channel. If you like what I do, then please subscribe, like, share, comment, because I need your help to grow the channel. If you wish to support us and you can afford it, please do it through Patreon. Here you will find exclusive content also about the Mississippi rifle and the production of the guns in the early decades of the 19th century. And also please be a member of the History of Weapons and War platform. And what more to say? Thank you very much for tuning in. Until next time, stay cool and keep your powder dry. But before I leave you like this, I have to tell you that the next chapter will focus on the use of the rifle. I'm going to talk about tactics, accoutrements, and drill. Everything you have to know to use your Mississippi rifle properly. So stay tuned.